Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or somebody you know would like to be on the show and have a chat with me, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11, or reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11 at fossadon.org. All right, so with that out of the way, coffee's like a third of the way, but I'm already energized because I was having a great conversation before we got started with my guest, and I'm looking forward to hearing all sorts of great things they have to say about a lot of stuff, honestly. And my guest today is April Speight. April, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. Hi, everyone. My name is April Speight. I have been in this tech space now for just a little over 10 years. And I started out over in fashion, I would say, but being here now, I can definitely say it's just a lot. There's a lot that's happening.
It's just a lot.
Always happening.
Yeah,
But how are you
I'm
doing?
doing great. I'm looking forward to this
That's good.
conversation. Like we were talking before we got started, for folks who might not know, like April and I have never actually had a conversation before that's not text based. So it'll be great to chat with you for an hour and learn about all the things that you find interesting in tech. And how I love to start conversations is like where you got started. Like, do you remember like a
Yeah.
visceral moment, like when you realized like technology was something that you wanted to do for the rest of your professional career?
Yeah, so I would say it's probably a little bit more morbid in terms of
No,
how I
no,
got
morbid
into this
stories are
space.
fun.
But I think it's important because it ends up becoming an important topic when I am speaking with usually women that are interested in getting into tech. So I mentioned in the beginning, I used to work in fashion. I was a stylist, I was a menswear stylist, and then I was also a visual merchandiser. And starting in there was great and it was good. And at the same time, I was also married to my ex-husband at that time.
Hmm.
And so when things ended with my ex-husband, I came back home and I was living with my mom and I was still working in the fashion world. That was the morbid part of the conversation, the ex-husband.
Oh,
But
I was waiting for something juicy.
yes.
Okay. Anyway,
No, that was
all
the
right,
morbid part.
all right.
But coming back home, I was just like, I need to have a change in life. I need something new and I need more income than what I'm getting right now in
Sure.
fashion. And so, therefore, I was looking at what skills I currently possess beyond everything I was doing in the fashion world. But it turns out a lot of what I was doing there actually applied to what I ended up doing as my first role in tech. But when I went to embark on my job search journey for something in tech, I realized that it was tough finding something at the time as someone that didn't have any tech experience on
Hmm.
paper.
Sure.
Now, what I did have on paper, however, was a certificate that I had earned in business project management.
Okay.
And so throughout my time in that program, I was learning about project management, but believe it or not, at no point in the program did we look at it from a technical lens.
Interesting.
So when I went looking for roles in project management, because I said, okay, I can say that I've learned this stuff, I kept seeing a bunch of roles that were based around working in IT. And
Hmm.
I was like, this is so odd because we never talked about
Yeah.
IT at any point, like in my program. So that's where actually my fashion skills or my experience in fashion came into play because a lot of what I was doing from a customer service perspective, working one on one with clients, as well as doing floor sets whenever we were changing the look of the store, that was more or less a lot of project management
Yeah.
in itself. It might not have been tech related, but it was all around managing a project. And so when I had my first interview, that's what I really heavily leaned on. And funny enough, that day when I interviewed, it was with two different individuals. One is a person who ended up becoming my manager, and then the second is a person who would have been considered my skip level manager.
Okay.
And when my skip level had came into the room, he ran all the like IT department. He came in the room, sat down, looked at my resume, looked up at me, and said, "Do you like computers?" And I was like, "Yeah." He was like, "Well, that's good enough for me." So it was like it was so great because it's like here I am in my first interview for a tech role with this guy that like leads the entire department, and part of me is like nervous because it's just like like, what is he going to ask me, But that was literally what he asked. I remember top of mind, like that's the first thing he asked when he walked in the room and sat down. I will definitely say though, looking back, that entire team I started out with in tech was probably one of the best teams I've ever worked with in that IT department. And when I did eventually leave that job, by the time I left, the guy that ran the department, he had already actually left and went to another company. But on my very last day, for those of us who like actually work inside the offices, usually we have going away parties. It's like things of the past, I feel like these days. But when I did my going away party, he actually left his job early to come to my going away party. So it was just like, it was a really like nice moment. And in the first book that I wrote, I actually dedicated that book to that entire team because they were really like the stepping stone in my journey in tech and also my journey into programming because we had some really great developers as well that I worked with. But that's my origin story. I would say I needed more money. I found a job and it worked out for the best. And like most people, you leave for more money, and that's why I left because money can definitely resolve some problems.
So you said a few things that I really want to dive into, and I'm gonna try to do them not rapid fire. So please bear with me.
Oh, you
So,
can rapid fire.
so you said something about like project management, like the quote unquote like PM in quotes, right? It's funny because you mentioned like how you can do like a PM curriculum, and there's no tech involved, even though the jobs are very very similar, right? Like it's
Yeah.
about managing time, expectations, and deadlines, and budget, and these sort of things. And my father-in-law is like in sort of project management. And when I first met him, he said that he was a project manager, and I immediately assumed he was an IT project manager. So I was like, "Oh, like what kind of tech is your company?" He's like, "Tech." Like, no, like I work on buildings and contractors, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the question that I have is, you know, what skills were easily transferable from like I guess like a non-tech PM sort of role and to a tech one, and like what were, other than just learning tech, like what were some things that are just drastically different between the two disciplines?
Yeah. So the first skill I would say that transferred over very well is the ability to accommodate or adjust to different personalities. Because as much as it's important to understand the technology and what we do, depending on whatever project you're working on, that's great to have those skills. But if you struggle with communicating with others, really tailoring conversations just based on different personality types, that can really hurt a project team for sure. And I would say having worked in fashion and for me, I was in luxury fashion of all places. So there was a lot of personalities
Sure,
that I
sure,
came
sure.
across like all the time. And we're talking about like entitled personalities.
Mm.
So having to have been involved in that area for years and then coming into tech, whereas I had the armor, if you will, to really like take on any certain ways that people may come across or talk and not feel like offended if someone says something a certain way. That I would say was a really important skill. And I know it's not something that's like technical in
Sure.
nature, but if you think about any team you may have worked on, and if you really try to drill down into what were some of the challenges or issues you had on that team, it usually comes back to communication. There was something in the communication that pretty much fell apart, and that's where being able to do a better job at managing relationships, communicating with others is big. So that was one skill. The second thing I would say that was really helpful as well, and especially now in my space, is that when I was in fashion, it was always important to keep up with the latest and what was happening and
Mm.
also have product knowledge of what was brand new. Coming into now, one, when I was in project management, and two, now that I'm in cloud advocacy, it's important to be very understanding of what everyone else is doing in the market, and then also being very knowledgeable of what like my own company that I work for, like what we have and what we're doing and what we can speak to. And I would say doing that in fashion prepared me a lot for being in tech because it makes me more credible when I do have ideas or I want to discuss something that maybe a competitor is doing in a way we need to think about things in that nature. That's super helpful as well. And it just keeps me more up to speed on what's going on. It's almost like second
Yeah.
nature, I would say, to know what's happening. And from a project management perspective, depending on like the flavor of project management you're doing, because I know every company does things differently. But for some of the stuff that I've done at Microsoft, if I had ideas for something new, whether it was just like a new feature, for example, because I initially started doing feature work when I first came to Microsoft. So like if it was something new that I wanted to bring, I need to have that level of awareness of what's happening everywhere else. And then two, I need to be able to like spec it out to a point where I can detail like, okay, these are the features it's going to have, because once this thing becomes a thing, I now need to talk about it. And if I don't understand how things work, if I don't understand the ins and outs of it, it's kind of hard to like
Yeah.
to continue that part of the job. And it's the same way in fashion when you're trying to sell something to someone. Like I used to work in jewelry at one point, selling diamonds, like rings and stuff. And you only get so far by saying, look at this pretty thing
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
shines.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
get much further when you can start diving deeper into all the qualities and the characteristics of the stone and things like that. So it applies to tech as well, but for me, technology background aside, those are some of the skills I would say definitely paid off coming into this space for this work that I do and have done.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating, and I do one thing that you brought up a little bit, and I want to maybe talk about a little bit more is like, you come from this space where, um, design's very important, right? Like that's very obvious
Mm-hmm.
from that, like a designer, like design's very important, and I equate design a little bit with experiences, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
aesthetically pleasing things, like they typically they bring like higher emotion, and they want make people want to buy things or
Yeah.
make people want to, right? And in my head as somebody in technology, like I think of like user experiences, right? Like not
Mm-hmm.
UI designs specifically, like oh this button should go here, but like what is the journey of somebody that's using a tool or a site or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Um, so as somebody that has a background in thinking about things like at that really high level, like I imagine for you when you came into tech, like you probably were speaking a language that a lot of people in tech like have a really hard time understanding, right? And that's not to knock
Mm-hmm.
developers that might not care as much about user experience, or they don't have the skills. Like I talked about this a little bit before we got started. Like I just don't have the skills, it feels like. Did you feel like
Mm-hmm.
you had immediate value to bring to the conversation with that design background, with that understanding of like what brings like positive emotion to something?
Yeah, I would say for me, and maybe my experience was very much a unicorn experience coming into tech. And especially I noticed it when I came to Microsoft because I found that the input that I had to share was valuable, not because like I just felt like it was valuable, but it's been told to me that my perspective was a new perspective. And I've also been told that the experience that I had coming from both more of the fashion side and then some of the other things I've done as well, once coming into tech, a lot of folks liked that.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was hired, I was expected to bring that,
Yeah.
which I think is super important because some teams, not saying Microsoft in particular, but just in general, when people onboard to some groups, some folks are looking for someone that's going to think like everyone else and they're
Yeah.
just going to follow like whatever the game plan is and that's it. But when you're able to find a team that is looking for a new fresh perspective, that's when I think you really hit the jackpot. And so when I came to Microsoft, for example, that is something that I was just like explicitly
Yeah.
told was that they wanted my input. They wanted my perspective. And I would say that actually felt really good because you hear so many things about experiences that people have working in this industry, especially if you don't have a technical background, or if you don't, you don't have a computer science degree or anything, or if you're self-taught. And I will say, yes, some people do unfortunately have those experiences where their input isn't valued. No one wants to hear their opinion because they don't have, the right credentials to share.
Yeah.
And I think that's wrong. But if you are able to find an opportunity where that input is valued, definitely take it. And if you are someone that's searching for someone to bring on board to a team, having that diversity in thought is super helpful as well, because you don't want a team full of people that are conforming to groupthink,
Yeah.
because then it's kind of hard to innovate.
Yeah.
You want someone that's going to come in there and like positively disrupt everything that's going on, I would say. So I would say to this day, that's still the expectation when I take on a new scope of something at work. Management's looking for me to bring that different perspective that I usually have. And so that's what I've ran off and away
Yeah.
with, and it's been it's been good for me, I would say.
Yeah,
So
I
far.
imagine it's also quite empowering to be told that like we want to hear your unique voice. I
Hmm.
also think that it might be a bit um anxiety inducing because like I can speak for me personally. Like I don't you don't want to
Hmm.
let all of the opinions out, right? Because sometimes some of the
Yeah.
opinions aren't really helpful. And I mean,
Yeah.
if somebody is bringing you in or asking you to like, hey April, we want your unique opinion. We want you to critique the product or critique this idea. Like there's probably some calculus that goes on in your head. It's like, okay, like how far can I go before it becomes kind of unproductive, or I
Yeah.
don't do a very good job of getting the point across. Like, how do you balance that?
Mhm. So I fully believe in the whole notion of, I'm going to complain about something. I'm also going to provide a solution.
Yeah. Okay.
But if I'm complaining with no solution, then I'm just talking to be talking. I'm just
Mm.
talking because I want to hear myself speak.
Yep.
That for me has been a really good litmus test. So whenever anyone is looking for feedback, or they want some insight in something that they've created, I usually, in my head, that's how I would say I categorize what I do and don't share. And it's not to say that everything has a solution, because there just are some things that I don't know in the moment how to
Yeah.
resolve
Yeah.
for. And so that's when it can be a little more tricky in terms of like, how do I give that feedback? But for the things that I know, I feel a certain way about,
Yeah.
I do try to offer up suggestions or alternatives. And people like that,
Yeah.
because it's one thing to just complain about a
Yes.
product all
Yes.
day long.
Yes.
And I'm sure, like, from like an engineering perspective, it's one thing to just get a long list of just stuff that people hate. And it's like, all
Sure.
right,
Yeah.
great. But I feel like you'll probably have more value if some suggestions are given in terms of like ways to potentially improve it or what would make it better. And so for me, if you're asking my critique on a product, you're asking for my feedback or my input, that's what I'm going to meet you with is, these are the things that I noted that could be improved, and these are some suggestions to consider in terms of how to improve it. And so that's what helps me. The other thing too is I try to get a feel for who I'm speaking with as well,
Yeah.
because everyone receives feedback different. If you're asking me for feedback about something that you created, anything that I'm going to share is going to be constructive,
Mm-hmm.
like criticism. It's
Mm-hmm.
not to tear you down
Sure.
and make you feel like you're the world's worst like developer or anything. But I also do want to take the emotion into it, because while we might not show it physically on our face, internally we do feel a certain way every time someone gives us feedback about something
Oh,
that
sure.
we've created.
Sure.
I would be lying if I said like I've never felt bad, but there's
Yeah.
a part of you that does, like, it does sting a little bit. So I do try to be
Mm-hmm.
sensitive to that as well. And for some folks, I do have to tailor the way I give feedback, because I am a very blunt person. I hate
Mm.
sugarcoating stuff
Yeah.
because I feel like it gets us nowhere. But I know for some individuals, you do have to soften the blow a little bit. in order to not bring too much emotion into a conversation of that nature. And so, but if I can be honest, for the people who do like to talk more bluntly, those are my favorite
Yeah.
people to give feedback to, because I can say what I have to say and know that I'm not coming off as like I'm offending someone for feedback that I'm giving.
I'm gonna tell you right now, like same. I
Mhm.
like it. Let me ask you this, and I'm
Yeah.
asking this because everything you just said, I 100% subscribe to, and there's this and I equated to myself personally with I'm very data oriented, very analytical,
Yes.
right? So like my question for you is, you know, like here's an example. Somebody comes to you, like maybe you have a one-on-one with your manager or whatever, right? And they
Hmm.
give you like some feedback, right? Some critical feedback. But they have like no tactical like example of like
Hmm.
how do you respond to that? I'm like just quickly. Like I'd imagine it's very similar to me.
Yeah. That's the worst,
Yes.
first and
Yep.
foremost,
Okay.
because I need the data. I
Yeah.
need the proof. I need the receipts.
Yes.
I need
Yes.
to
Yes. Yes. Yes.
understand like where this is coming
Yeah.
from. And so receiving some feedback of that nature, I'm going to ask in hopefully the most neutral,
Sure. Sure.
emotion
You
gone
should get into
way
politics.
to
You're pretty
just,
good at like saying the right thing, the exact right thing. I can already tell these sort of things. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, I would ask in one of the more, neutral way possible, could you provide an example?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would love to
Mm-hmm.
get. And if there's no example, especially if it's not like an explicit example, then I dig a little
Mm-hmm.
deeper to get an understanding of, okay, what exactly like is going on here. And like with anyone, if you can give me the proof,
Yeah.
great. Because at the end of the
You can
day,
fix
I
it.
want to take accountability.
Yes.
That too, I can fix it too. And I want to take accountability for anything that has been observed that I've done incorrectly. So but I'm also not the type to apologize for no reason. That's why I need
Mm.
to like see the proof of what it is, because I know for um some folks are okay with apologizing for things they may have done, or taking accountability for something, even if it's like not directly on them. For me, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I need to know that I have my hand somewhere in this
Yeah.
before I, embark down that path. So I do ask for the examples, but I think this is where it's really important. And I've learned this even from when I spent time as a manager, the people manager. It's that if you are going to deliver feedback to someone, it is, to your point, very important to bring explicit examples rather than just very vague
Yeah.
observation with nothing to point to, because you're going to get met with that opposition. And if you're not ready to now like share, this is the example of time when blah, blah, blah happened, it's very hard on the other end as an IC, especially to receive that feedback. And then next thing you know, you're going down the rabbit hole of trying to explain yourself and you have no facts to back up anything you're saying. So I like to head into conversations with some data
Yeah.
point of some sort that I could point to. Yeah.
That's great. I think so. And this leads me to like my next thing that I find pretty fascinating about folks like you specifically, who you have like not to use like the really cliche like left brain versus brain way of thinking, right? For a lot of people who might not know,
Hmm.
like a lot more left brain orientation, like they're more analytical, they're more
Yeah.
problem solving, like that. And on the right side, it's creativity and things like that. And you're kind of both, right? Like you have this creative
Yeah.
background, like you have this ability to think about. You probably have great spatial awareness, for instance, right? And on the other side, the analytical side, like you're able to kind of put pen to paper, right? And I'm
Hmm.
curious, like how is that like that's magic sauce, right? Like how does that magic sauce like help you, like not even in tech, but like in life, like being able to
Yeah.
look at a problem, figure out like how to design the solution to that problem, and then actually implement it.
Yeah. I would say for me, this is where it can become a bit tricky because if it's something that I don't feel connected to or any level of passion towards, it's actually more difficult to turn that on and
Mm,
use both sides of my
mm,
brain. And I have to be in the right mental space. I know we're talking about brains, but like I
yeah,
literally
yeah,
have to be in the
yeah.
right mental space to actually like employ both brains at the same time towards something. And so that's like the first thing I would say before diving into this topic. But in terms of how it has help me out, I would say the role that I'm doing right now, I haven't talked about a lot about what I'm actually like the
Yeah.
area I work in
We'll
right
get
now at
there. We'll get
Microsoft,
there.
but
We'll
for
get there.
context, yeah, it does help with answering this question. So like at a high level, I'm within cloud advocacy. And so what that entails is engaging a lot with the developer community. We create content, we get feedback, we pass that to the product teams and engineering as well. And there's other things we do too, but the part of the role where this comes into play is when it's time to create samples for something.
Mm,
And this is where having both sides of the brain is helpful because the creative part of me is just like if you take back when I used to work in mixed reality, for example, the creative part of me is like, yeah, we can create this really cool app that does this and does that, and it has this feature, and you can do that. And all that stuff is fun. But at the end of the day, if you don't use the other side of the brain to think things through more analytically, more logically in terms of like, well, what does it take to implement this? And what's going to happen after the app's there? How do we amplify it? If you're missing that part, then all you really have is an app that no one knows about,
sure.
you know?
Sure.
And so that's where having the two come together is helpful. Now, in some companies, that is divided in terms of like there is a person that does the creative stuff. There is a person that does the more now let's put some more thought and method behind what we're doing. And
Yes.
that's fine too. I'm in a unique position, like a lot of my other peers in my org, where we do have to bring both of those into one person. And so you can have the great ideas, you can do and build the cool things, but you also want to bring in that other part that is analytical because once you have the cool thing, well, then once you have the idea of the cool thing, I would say now you have to go through the process of figuring out, well, what does it entail to actually carry this out? And in the midst of that, once it's here, what are we doing to amplify it and things of that nature? Identifying any risks that may be involved in what it is we're trying to do. If you can have um, both of those things come together, especially in the role that I'm in, then you're going to be golden.
Yeah.
It's just like the role is then made for you. So it is a very unique thing that we do because uh, yeah, we're very vibrant, very out there, very public
Sure.
facing, but we're
Sure.
also very technical
Yeah.
at the same
Yeah. Yeah.
time. And so it's an interesting blend, I would say, of the
Yeah, I
two.
mean it's a very fine line to walk to because of the fact that
Mhm.
you're treated as subject matter experts in the community, and that's good. I have a lot of opinions on like being a subject matter expert. Like I'm very much of the belief
Mhm.
that like we're really not experts in anything. Um,
Right,
but
exactly.
and I do concede to the fact that like some people know things way better than others because I think that's just reality.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I don't want to pivot too hard, but like you mentioned, like some of the work that you have done previously, like,
Mhm.
for folks that don't know April's background, like it's very interesting kind of the progression in tech, or I guess the sequence of events in which led you to like where you are today, like when like so you got into tech as like in the project management space. Like when did you
Mhm.
realize that like you had an interest or an affinity to like actually develop or build things?
I will say this occurred, that first role that I had in tech, actually. One of my former coworkers, he unfortunately was going into retirement early due to some health concerns. And I remember that week that he was leaving, we were dividing up the tasks that he would do typically as part of his scope. And one of the last things that was left was to run SQL reports and not just run them, but also create some SQL reports as well.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I had just started playing around a little bit with programming, but nothing like deep in the weeds serious. And so I volunteered for it. And he had maybe all of 30 minutes to train me on creating and running SQL reports. And then like that was it after that because that was his last day.
Oh wow.
And
Okay.
so from there, something about that experience and something about putting together the logic behind what it takes to do that. And it was such a minor like thing that was involved in the role, but it was enough for me to just want to like dive a little bit deeper. And so as time went on and I started with a different company a couple years later, one of the developers there, this was with a startup, one of the developers there, he started doing more or less like mentor sessions in the middle of the weekday, I mean, in the middle of the workday with folks. And we were a small team, like less than 30 employees. So we were very small. And he would just spend time teaching programming concepts. There was no like gain out of it for him. It was just him wanting to
Yeah.
spend time teaching these things.
Yeah.
And so from time to time, I would pop in and it just became more interesting to me. And it wasn't until I really thought about a career change and I thought I wanted to be a data scientist.
Mm.
And I wanted to get out of project management. And I was like, I want to do something else. And I thought data science was cool. And I was like, well, what do I need to know to do data science? And I was like, oh, this Python thing looks interesting.
This
So
Python
I
thing,
started
yeah.
learning Python. Yeah, I started learning Python. And then once I learned Python, it was time for the data science part of the curriculum I made for myself. And then I was just like, data science sucks. So
Yeah.
and that was like
Yeah.
a younger me. But what it left me with at the time was, all right, I have all this Python knowledge, but I don't want to do data science. So what
Mm.
do I do from here?
Yeah.
And I was like, I'll just stick with it. And that's when I had at the time got into chatbots and AI assistants and conversational design. And this is pre Chat GPT
Yeah.
days.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I was like really getting into that at the time. And I was doing some work with like Twilio at the time as well. And that's when I really started to dive in. I attended my very first workshop with Twilio one weekend, and just sitting there, I was just like, I am so behind from like a technical
Sure.
perspective and understanding
Sure.
like what's going on. And literally, after I left that workshop, that is where the official like origin story of my
Mm.
programming
Yeah.
background
Yeah.
happened because I went home, got on Code Academy, and was it what's the other one? Not Udemy. Slipping my mind right now. There was another one, and I just went headfirst
Mm.
into just learning more and more and more and more, and I just didn't stop from there. I had the thing where like I hate not knowing how to do stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I get that feeling like I'm the only one in the room that doesn't understand, I hate that. And that probably stems back from like childhood. Random story really quick.
All right.
So I was a tap dancer growing
Okay.
up.
Of course. Of
And
course. Yeah. Yeah.
at one point, of course, all right,
Yeah.
as one does. And at one point I switched studios. And when I switched studios, I didn't know any of the girls there, and it was all new. We were learning how to do this one thing called drawbacks. And I mean, if I had tap shoes on, I'd do it for you. But that was my first time ever hearing about this thing, and I didn't know what they were, didn't know how to do them. And as the teacher was trying to show me, and I'm trying to do them very horribly, by the way, two girls in the class started laughing at me.
Oh wow.
And then I was like, oh no, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I went home, Isaac, and I sat there in my kitchen for hours until I finally got how to do this
All
move.
right.
So when I finally went to my next class a week later, I was moving across the
All right.
floor.
So
So
I've
yeah.
clocked you. April Speight, I've clocked you. You are a so I don't want to use the term perfectionist. I don't want to use the term obsessive compulsive because those are not fair things. I say that you have a healthy respect for doing it right. And
Yes.
and
Yes.
one of so as somebody who is very similar, like to the extent where it's like Isaac just finish the thing, like it's done, like just do the last thing, and then I'm constantly kind of rewire,
Yeah.
re mess with or whatever, right? Like I subscribe to all the things you just said. And like the fact that you're very results oriented because you like data so much, like I can imagine that
Hmm.
you run into these situations a lot where you have an idea and you're curious and you kind of have to
Yeah.
time box yourself, or else you get into
Yes.
trouble. Like
Yes.
getting into trouble is something that I think, I don't want to say that you and I are exactly like in this regard, but like it's something we both very probably struggle with is like, I really want to understand how this thing works. And then you look at the clock and it's like, oh, it's 7 p.m.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I get into those.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and with that, like, you mentioned like, and I joked kind of offhand, like this thing called Python, right? And you think about like what Python is
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
A lot of people like it's not just data science anymore. Like Python is used for all sorts of different things. So you made the right choice with like Python as being like the first language to learn for what
Yeah.
it's worth. Um, but I'm curious to know, like, you, with your background, and we were
Hmm.
talked about user experiences a little bit, right? And if you want to think about like, even fast forwarding to today and even tomorrow, like the chat assistant AI powered whatever like interfaces for a lot of tools, right, wrong, or indifferent, is the chat interface, right? Where you
Yes.
have conversational experiences with a machine, more or less. Um,
Hmm.
and I'm curious to know, like, as somebody that does have an interest in in aesthetic and interested in design, interested in experience, is it really the best approach to have these sort of like when you're engaging with
Mm.
AI for it to be in the
Yeah.
form of natural language conversation, or is there like, not to like make you like the next thought leader in this space, because I don't think you're
No, I
trying to
get
do that,
that.
but I'm curious as to like, because I'll stop my rant in a second, but like
No, you're
my
fine.
reason for asking is this, right? When a lot of people engage with these assistants, they'll ask a question and
Hmm.
they'll get the response, and they'll use
Yep.
the response, or they'll throw away the conversation and ask the same question a different way, and it's not a
Yeah.
conversation. It's like Google
No.
search, right? Like
Yes.
I was taught, like, for shameless plug, like I have a new TikTok show where I talk about tech inside a cold plunge. That's a different thing. But like the latest one that I did was about these AI assistants and how it's not Google search. Like, don't treat it like Google
Right.
search. Treat it like you're actually having a conversation with something that can actually might be able to learn some context from you. So I'll stop talking. Is the conversation experience or interface the best way to engage with these tools, in your opinion? And you don't have to come up
I
with a
think
better
you have a
solution.
really No, I think you actually have a really good perspective on this. So, here's what I've learned in just observing people who are using these technologies, like most of us, for the very first time. um, Believe it or not, people don't know how to ask questions. And I
I'm
think
guilty.
that
I'm guilty of that. I'm
as
so guilty of
you
it.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
but like, and as simple as that may sound, it is like a very harsh reality as well, because we I say we just collectively, for those of us who are helping people learn how to use things, these interfaces where you can chat with these models. We spend time teaching people how to ask the questions and how to get exactly the information that they need. And what I find so fascinating is that for me mentally, it's no different than if I were to ask you questions back and forth. I'm either going to get the response that I hope you give me, or I'm going to keep having to ask questions to really get what it is I need from you. There's something that changes though when people now have to apply that same rule to speaking with a model instead. It's interesting because in theory, you could more or less converse the same way,
Mm-hmm.
but there's somewhere there's a blocker that's like some people just don't grasp in
Yeah.
terms of how to communicate with these models in this way. And then it becomes more of the, well, I tried to use the tool and it just didn't
Yeah.
give me what I wanted. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just like, we can't always blame it on the technology. We have
Sure,
to
we
take a bit of
can, because we're
accountability.
humans.
I know,
We
right?
have no faults.
Exactly. Perfect,
Yeah.
right? But a lot of it has to do with how are we communicating? And as humans, can we be better communicators in terms of
Yeah.
how we communicate with each other? I think the fact that we haven't mastered communicating with each other, and therefore that's where there is some struggle in communicating with large language models.
Mm.
And because of that, that's where you have some folks who excel with using these sort of tools, and some who are just like, throw it away.
Yeah.
This thing is pointless. It doesn't do what I thought it was going to do. So is a chat the right place? I think for some people. I don't think collectively it's the right interface for everyone until we get better at how we communicate with each other. Now, interesting point you made that some individuals are using these tools like a search engine. And I am guilty of doing
Sure.
that
We
as
all are. We
well.
all
I
are.
can definitely say that. But if you also think about it, is that a lot of the bigger known search engines today, well, what did they do? They integrated
Yeah. Yeah.
their
Yeah.
thing with
Which,
their search
yeah, good,
engine.
good, bad, or
Yeah.
indifferent, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's helpful. It's helpful when it's helpful, and then it's bad when it's bad.
Yeah. You
I
know,
would say.
you bring up an interesting point about, and not to dive too deep into human nature, but like, I think in general, like a lot of us, myself included, are very bad at communicating what we actually want. We have an idea
Yeah.
in our brain of what we actually want,
Yeah.
but correlating it into like a coherent sentence is sometimes challenging.
Hmm.
So to expect us to do this with like intelligent sand is
Hmm.
kind of interesting, because honestly, like you see a demo of it, and you're just like,
Yeah.
oh, this thing knows exactly what I want. No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Right? This thing, it's
No, it
like, and I'm
doesn't.
not going to go into my
Yeah.
rant about what these things are versus what they aren't, but like, I'm
Right.
I one of the things that I'm pretty interested too is like on the flip side of that, right? Where
Yeah.
we blindly trust the smart sand with the response that it gives us. And this leads
Yeah.
into kind of like we were talking about a little bit this before we got started, is like some of the work that you're doing right now in like this responsible AI space, right? And
Hmm.
trusting like the outputs of these some of these models. And not just that, but like also how we build the context and how we build our prompts to ensure that we're doing the right thing for the right situation. And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts about
Yeah.
it. I know I just threw a lot at you, but like let's just hear a little bit about your
No.
musings on this.
Yeah, I have two things. I want to answer that, but I do want to
Sure.
provide something first on the first point in terms of human nature and how we communicate and asking for what we want. When I was in the second grade, second or third grade, in my English class, we had the assignment where we had to write, or we had to write down how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Mm.
Simple task, right? What was interesting about this was that once you had everything written down, the teacher would read out loud what you had, and then she would physically do it in front of you. That was an
What grade
eye
was this?
opener to the
What grade was
class.
this?
This was like second or third grade, I
Wow.
want to say.
Interesting.
Regular
Okay.
old public school system, so
Yeah.
not private
I
school
mean,
or anything with like a super fancy
I
curriculum.
think that's pretty
But
ingenious. But anyway, I interrupt. Continue.
yes, and it was interesting, and I'm so glad I went last because the earlier students that went first, like on their paper, it was like, get bread,
Yeah.
get the
Yeah. Yeah.
jelly,
Yeah.
get a knife, put the jelly on the bread, and sandwich is
Like
done.
the iterative steps to building a sandwich. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So, because the teacher was doing the things in front of you at the same time, it was so comical because I know for those of you who are listening and not watching, you won't be able to see this, but like, let's say like this was the bread and this was the jelly. So, the student may write, put jelly on bread, and the teacher took it literally, which I thought was funny and was also
Mm.
genius. So, she would take the jelly and then just sit it on bread, and it was like the whole jar
Uh.
of jelly just sitting on top of the bread. And she's just like, this isn't a sandwich. When I caught onto what she was trying to get out of
Yeah.
us, when I tell you, I wrote
That
paragraphs
is.
about how to make a
Oh.
peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Oh.
I will never forget
That
that.
is
And I think
amazing.
looking back, I think that was like the third grade or so, third or fourth, actually not second yet, so either third or fourth. That's when I would say I knew the value in being explicit in what you want, and in providing instructions on how to do things. That's probably why I love writing tutorials now. So another origin story. But that I would say is what sticks with me when I'm speaking with these models and asking for stuff. You have to have that level of specificity
Mm-hmm.
to really get the value that we're being told it provides. Now, from the perspective of ensuring that you get accurate, grounded, solid responses
Yeah, yeah,
back
yeah.
from the models, there is a certain level of having a working knowledge that comes into
Mm-hmm.
play. And not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I have a little bit of conspiracy theorist in me.
That's
You
fine.
have to question
That's fine.
everything,
That's fine.
you know?
Yeah.
Just like,
You're a
you have to
you are a
question
curious
everything.
person. I don't think it's a conspiracy theory.
Yes,
It's important to be curious. Like
it's very
I think
important.
there are ranges where the curiosity might go a bit off the rails, but that's a different conversation.
Hmm.
But I think being genuinely curious, it's better to be curious in my opinion than to be naive.
Yeah.
That's just my personal opinion.
Yes.
And you run into a lot of people that are quote unquote naive on things, and they just they
Hmm.
expect the best, or they trust the response or whatever. Um, and then you have people that are a bit more like, okay, what's actually going on here, and they want to push back a little bit.
Yeah.
But please
Yeah.
continue. I keep on interrupting you. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. So you have to keep that in the at the forefront, honestly, to just question everything and also to have a working knowledge of whatever you're passing into the model that you're trying to get a response for. There have been times where I've used some of the tools that we have today available in the market for speaking with these models, and I will see what happens to be a blatantly obvious, like, false thing. And the moment that I've like questioned it to say, like, where did you get this from? Or if I just straight up say this is incorrect, interesting enough, it apologizes and then provides the correct information. So in my head, that kind of like leaves me thinking two things. One, if I was ignorant to what's going on, I would have taken this as the gospel. Two, given that this model gave me inaccurate information, why did it if it knew that it wasn't right? And so that's where I think we're seeing more interesting features available. I forgot who announced this recently, so sorry, but there's was it is it OpenAI with the GPT models where
Yes.
it has, yeah, it spends a bit more time. I forgot the exact name of the feature,
The
but it spends
reasoning,
more time thinking. Yes, the
reasoning
reasoning.
level. Yeah.
Yes, that I found to be, it's helpful. And I know at Microsoft we announced something similar as well for our groundedness detection. We had this reasoning that's also available, whereas it'll catch a response that's ungrounded and then fix it before giving the output in
Yeah.
itself. I think as things continue to evolve in that manner, that will be very, very helpful. It does still beg the question, at what point do we fully rely on the output being the truth, of course? But I think the fact that we're getting to a point now where things like reasoning are happening does help with mitigating what's called hallucinations.
Yes.
And so it's helpful, yes, but you and I were speaking before we started today, when there's topics that I'm just flat out brand new to and I just don't understand what's going on, and I send the whole prompt that says explain XYZ
Yep.
to me
Yep.
like I'm a 5-year-old. I have also found myself in situations just taking what it's told me and like, okay, that's the truth, that's what it is, let me continue about my day. The problem with that is it does go against my whole thing of you need to have a working knowledge of some subject matter when you're engaging with these models to really understand the validity of what it's saying. But I have used it in that manner as well. And if I really am not sure about something, then I start going to some of the other, I try like three more other tools just to see what that says. And then I start comparing to see what the responses are. um, what I will say, because of just the fact that hallucinations are a thing, I do have my favorite chat-based tools that I prefer for certain subjects because of that. Because I do feel, without naming names, some are more strong with certain subjects than
Sure.
others.
Yeah.
Foreign language, I would say, was one of the big things. I've been learning French since 2020, And when I enrolled in my French class this year and I was doing my homework, I was having some challenges with some of the translations and some of the grammar rules. So I went to one chat, asked a question, and then I was like, I don't think this is what it's supposed to be. So I went to another one, asked the same exact question, didn't change the prompt. This is now me doing an experiment. And I got a similar response with just a little bit of a difference. And then I went to a third one, and that's when I finally got the information based on what my teacher has shared, as well as some of the other platforms that I've been learning French with. And that's how I got to really get an understanding of the fact that some of these chat tools are better than others at certain subjects. I will stand by that for sure.
Yes.
Now I won't say who's better at what, but I will say you really have to do your due diligence to test the waters before landing on one and saying like, this is the one I use all the time for
Yeah.
like this certain specific task.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, and I know we're not 100% there yet, but like
Mm-hmm.
when we're able to effectively like test these different models against each other without having to like jump through a bunch of hoops. I know like it's getting easier. Like there are things like Olama, or there's other tools that's like, okay, just load this model, or some of the stuff like some of the GitHub is doing with like testing models. Um, like I would love to just like, here's a prompt, give me the response from these four models at the same
Yeah.
time. And I know I've seen websites that do it, um, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't trust them because like it's just a website. So I don't know if like the actual models are being used, that are being whatever. Anyway, but like
Mm-hmm.
I'm genuinely curious about like, and then I think there's almost like another layer that needs to be done where it's like, okay, validate that the outputs of these models are accurate. So like you can then build like
Mm-hmm.
some form of accuracy based in certain areas. Like your point about some models are better at different things is completely spot on. But unfortunately, because of like the interface for a lot of these different models, like ChatGPT is the most accessible, right? For
Mm-hmm.
like you can go out there and you can get Claude, or you can go out there and get Gemini or whatever, but it's not as accessible as going to like the openai.com/chat or whatever the URL is, right?
Yeah.
Um, so,
Mm-hmm.
so like we're kind of almost forced to use one because it's the easiest to get to,
Yeah.
and I don't know if
Yeah.
that's for good or bad, because I think that Chat
Yeah.
GPT is very good at some things, and like you said, it probably isn't as great at other things, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like most folks, that's the very first one I started out with using is ChatGPT. And then when I started to learn about other things that came to market, whether it's Gemini, whether it's Copilot, whether it's Claude, whether it's some other thing someone built, for example, I will definitely say I am one of those people who have like who is currently paying a premium subscription
Mm.
for
That's
certain
fine. That's
ones
fine.
just because it gives me what I wanted. It gives me what I expect from an output
Yes.
perspective, I would say. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize, I would say. But the accessibility of it all does really box people into one tool. And if that's your only impression of something that's chat interface based, like let's say you've only ever used Chat GPT, you haven't tried anything else that's out there, your impression is really going to be just really clouded by only knowing what it's been like with Chat GPT. You would have no
Mm-hmm.
insight into what could be better elsewhere. I do think that is an issue, especially if you tried something like Chat GPT once and then you're just like, oh, this sucks, I hate it.
Yep.
Well, there's other things out there, but if you never tried it, your whole notion of working with generative AI is now like, oh, it's the worst thing ever, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's bad too, because it's like, no, give it a chance. Try this other thing that probably like might have worked better. But, as someone who does find myself still to this day, like I do use Chat GPT here and there. I do think it does have value, but I also know that for certain tasks, I do have certain ones I like to use based on what I need
Yeah.
to accomplish, just that some are stronger than others. From a validating output perspective, and you talked about evaluations as well, and that's an area that I'm diving into more at work. But I'll bring up a point that you and I were discussing before we started, which is the output that we get from these models. We have to remember there's a human behind it. It wasn't
Yeah.
like this technology just made itself happen one day and all of a sudden it started just spewing information. There's an actual person or people who have actually trained these models with this information. And what have they trained it? What have they trained it on? Well, a lot of it's been trained on the internet. And the last I checked, the internet's not always valid.
Yeah.
There's just all types of stuff that's on the internet. And while some people have their own version of things that are true, it doesn't mean that everything that you see online is accurate. And it doesn't mean, and therefore it also doesn't mean that everything that gets generated by these models is accurate as well. That's why it's important to have things like evaluations to validate across various metrics for either performance or quality, or even risk and safety as well. And that's like a whole like completely different topic that I won't even dive into right now. But at the end of the day, someone like you, Isaac, someone like me who work in this space, I feel like we'll take the time to do our due diligence to evaluate what's being output. But the average person,
Yes.
they're not going to do that,
That was kind of
you
the point
know?
I was wanting to get to. It's like
Yeah.
if you're a non-technical person and
Mm-hmm.
you want to, I don't know, find a recipe for bolognese or something, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and there's only one real easy way for you to get to that, right? Then you're kind of forced to use a particular tool, and then you're kind of also forced to trust the response of that tool because you really don't know how it
Yeah.
works, and you don't know how to you haven't been no one's taught you how to accurately like question, right?
Yeah.
So, and especially like all the marketing around, not to knock marketing as somebody who is in marketing, um,
Mm-hmm.
like it is not silver, they're not silver bullets, right? Like it's very much
Yeah.
things that we need to be very careful with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny enough you mention it in terms of the bolognese is actually a perfect example because when you don't have the exposure to other ways things are done, it definitely can impact you. The simplest thing, somebody I posted a TikTok not too long ago. The cheese
Yep.
graters that you grate cheese on, it's like the kind of triangle shape or
Sure.
whatever. So, like a normal person, when I grate cheese, I have it sitting straight up, I grate, and then I call it a day. Well, this person decided to flip it over on its side and then grate that way
Mm-hmm.
and then lift it and slide the cheese into whatever. And everyone's just like, oh my
What a
gosh, I
psychopath.
didn't know you could do that.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, yeah,
But like the reality
yeah.
is, here I am like, wow, I never thought to just lay it on the table and then grate that way. And so when you don't have this exposure into what else is possible, what else is out there, it can really start to like cloud your judgment as well. And for me personally, and that applies to a lot of AI. I like AI. I know it's here to stay. It's not going to necessarily go away, but I think the work that I do in responsible AI is the part that I feel is really important from AI is going to happen, like it's going to happen and it is happening, but let's find the best way to do it responsibly. And that's how I spend my day now. I would say that's currently my thing is to get the word out there and in terms of like how do you create something that is done in a more responsible manner. And so but some people have written AI off in the early days, and
Yeah.
for good
Yeah.
reasons. There's various good reasons why people have done that, but I think when you don't have the exposure to all the different ways that you can use it, then you do miss out on some of the good stuff
Oh,
that
yeah, I totally
it
agree. And
offers.
like we're still at the beginning of this, so like hopefully it'll only get better.
Yes.
And
Yeah, hopefully.
one of the things, as we wrap up, this has been a great conversation. It's been great to get to know a little bit about your backstory and what interests you and like what are the things you're working on right now and for what it's worth, like these are conversations that I think are really important, not just right now, but as these things get more and more prevalent in everyday society, right? Like I imagine a future where every company has some form of a chatbot, right?
Yeah.
That's not like
Yeah.
that's a bit more sophisticated than what we've had in the past. So with that, we've talked about a lot of things, and one of the things I like to ask my guests at the end is like we've kind of talked about your career progression. We've talked about some of the things that have interested you in this space and the things that you're, working on now and the things that you're thinking about in the future. Like when you think about the hour that we've just spent together talking, like what are some of the things that you want folks to take away from it?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, if you are doing things with generative AI, just question everything.
Sure.
I can't stress that enough. And I mean question everything from the perspective of don't just take the outputs you're given as what I just say as like as the gospel. Definitely fact check. Make sure that you're getting valid responses based on what it's providing because there's a human behind it.
Sure.
And so the responses can be biased, which we've seen in various examples. But I think it's important to keep that in mind. The second thing I would say is from a career perspective, don't be afraid to pivot and want something different for yourself. Is it scary for some folks starting off? Absolutely. It can definitely be nerve-wracking. It can definitely comes with its ups and downs. But I think the worst thing that can happen is for you to wake up one day knowing that you want something different for yourself professionally, and then 15 more years go by and you never did anything towards that. I think that's worse. I'd rather have switched and failed and picked myself back up versus wondering for the next couple of years, what if, and then never getting that opportunity to try something new. So, with that said, just don't be afraid to try something new. And the internet exists. You can always
Yeah.
learn how to do XYZ if you want to pivot. So definitely use that as a resource. And plus, all these lovely large language models we
Yeah.
have that answer questions on how to do stuff.
Yeah.
So technology's there. We have technology. Use it.
Oh, I can't subscribe more to that. Thank you so much for your time, April. This has been great. For folks that aren't already following April and you want to see some of the stuff that she's working on, you can find her. One easy way is on Twitter. You can find her at Vogan Code. That's VOGUEANDCODE. And there'll also be some links to in the show notes to some other places you can find her and links to her books and things like that. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, of course. And before we sign off, do you have any parting words?
Yeah. You know what? Have a nice day,
Oh,
everyone. Whatever's going on in life right
yeah.
now, just take a moment and just smile. And I hope you have a very nice day. There's a lot happening in the
Yeah.
world all at once.
Yes, this is
And
quite true.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So just have a really lovely day.
yeah.
Whatever you do, make it a lovely one.
And I'll add on to that by, thank you so much for the folks that watched us live, and thank you for the folks that are watching us in the future, listening to us in the future. And I hope you enjoy your day as well. So for my friend April, my name is Isaac Levin. This has been Coffee and Open Source, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.